Welcome all. This is the Division of Philosophy, Religion, Psychology, and Linguistics annual lecture here at Reed College. Excuse me. I'm Kristen Scheibel. I'm chairing the Reed Religion Department. And today I'm serving as host for our event at the request of our divisional chair and professor of religion and humanities, Mike Fote, who's here. Our heartfelt welcome today extends not only to Reed students and faculty, but also to students and faculty from Williams, Carleton, and Northwestern. And of course, I'd like to offer the heartiest welcome to our esteemed speaker, Jason Ananda Josephson Storm. So as an introduction, JJ received his MTS. Oh, okay. JJ received his MTS from Harvard University and his PhD in religious studies from Stanford. He has held visiting positions at Princeton and in Europe. He's currently serving as professor of religion and chair of science and technology studies at Williams College. As a scholar of religion, JJ seeks to, quote, this is from his website, decenter received narratives in the study of religion and science, unquote. So in this way, he's opening up epistemological barriers, destabilizing the very foundational paradigms that scholars reify and rely upon. Our students read his work in our Required for Majors Theories and Methods seminar and have found him a productive and playful scholar to think with.
Whoever sleeps.
JJ's, if you could mute yourselves upon entry, that would help.
So I have the frames and
I might be able to mute. Okay, there we go. Let's see. JJ's prolific scholarship has contributed substantially in 3 domains of our field, namely Japanese religions, European intellectual history, and in the theory of the study of religion. JJ's Stanford dissertation titled Taming Demons, the Anti-Superstition Campaign and the Invention of Religion in Japan, 1853 to 1920, traces the importation. I'm going to do that again. Okay. Traces the importation of Euro-American concepts of religion, science, and secularism into Japan and the concomitant intellectual, legal, and cultural transformations that ensued. This groundbreaking line of research culminating in JJ's first award-winning book, The Invention of Religion in Japan, from University of Chicago Press in 2012. JJ's interest in European intellectual history led him to archival research in 5 different countries and to his second monograph, The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of Human Sciences. This too from University of Chicago Press in 2017. Here, JJ traces, quote, the history of the notions of disenchantment in the births of philosophy, anthropology, sociology, folklore, psychoanalysis, and religious studies, illustrating a central irony, quote, the myth of the mythless modernity formed at the very time that Britain, France, and Germany were in the midst of occult and spiritualist revivals. So today's lecture draws from his 3rd and very recent monograph, Meta-Modernism, The Future of Theory. Very ambitious title, and it's coming to us from the University of Chicago Press as well, 2021. This book proposes new research methods for the humanities and the social sciences. The seed for this radical proposed intervention may have been planted while he was an undergraduate negotiating his intellectual place between philosophy and religion. So there's hope for you readies out there who are still trying to find your spot. Even as he trained in East Asian languages and philosophy, JJ nurtured his interest in critical theory and the Frankfurt School, Hegel, Francophone structuralisms and post-structuralisms. And since he keeps up to date, it should be no surprise that in this most recent work, he trains attention on analytic philosophy in relation to post-colonial critical race and gender theory. Finally, and this is important, to limit distraction, please stay muted during the lecture. And also refrain from using the chat function. I suppose you could send me, Kristen Scheibel, a chat if you need to, but keep the chat out of JJ's purview because he is going to be lecturing, and afterward we'll have a robust Q&A. So hold your questions until the Q&A. So now our lecture entitled The End of Theory of Religion, Process Social Ontology, and Reconceptualizing the Human Sciences. I give you JJ, all yours.
Thanks. So first, I just want to say what a pleasure and an honor it is to appear before you all. This is really a great crowd of scholars whose work I know, of friends and colleagues and students, even more importantly, from 3 different institutions, some of whom are even currently in classes with me and are not sick of hearing me monologue about stuff. So I'm delighted that you all could come out and experience this. I'm going to start by sharing my screen in this funny advanced slides as virtual background way, and we'll assume that that will work, but it'll take it a second to prepare slides. And sometimes this takes a second. Okay, and then you can see me, I hope, and you can see the slides. Do we all see me in the slides? Show one hand, thumbs up if somebody can see. Okay, all right. Okay, so, and to advance the slides. Okay, so you're welcome and encouraged to tweet. What I'm going to be talking about today is based on an article in progress which focuses some of the theoretical framework of my most recent book on religious studies. It's a big book. It has a lot of things in it. I'm going to try and cut off a little thin slice of it and look at those implications for religious studies in particular in today's talk. In outline, if I'm not too much in front of these, it has several parts, an opening. No, I need to point in the opposite direction. Okay, good, I'm being mirrored. An opening, and then it's going to talk about what was theory of religion. I'm going to get some categories and decay, the critique outside of religious studies. I'm going to advocate a process social ontology. Along the way, you'll learn how to destroy any discipline you want, and then you'll learn what's on the other side of critique. If there's time, I'll talk about comparison after de-essentializing religion, and then I'll try and give you at least one case study, maybe 2 in the conclusion, so you know that this isn't fluff. I'm not just making it up, but I think it has concrete implications. I want to start off with a kind of ominous tone. Imagine that there is some kind of brooding music playing in the background, but don't let that discourage you. The tone will shift. But let me therefore shift to the next slide and begin. Okay. Here we go, and I'm starting my timer. Okay. Religious studies used to be able to presuppose its object of analysis. Our methodological pluralism and our global coverage were underwritten by postulating the existence of religion as a universal aspect of human experience found in all cultures. It was often taken for granted that there were different religions that, by virtue of their classification as such, ostensibly shared a common essence, function, and perhaps even origin. This position not only organized religion departments, but was also supported by other disciplines, such as philosophy and political science, that tended to grant the universality of religion even as they distinguished their disciplinary objects from it. For a considerable period of time, the special task allotted to religious studies was to advance the understanding of the nature of religion. But those days are long gone. For more than 50 years, as I will show, a host of theorists have challenged the universality of religion and its utility as an analytical category. It may surprise those of you coming from other disciplines, but most scholars trained in religious studies today now consider it naive to presume religion as a concept. Indeed, while American religion departments are still structured the way they were back when we postulated world religions with a common essence, a generation of scholars has been formed in the context of claims such as, quote, there is no data for religion, end quote, and that, quote, religion is solely the creation of the scholar's study with no independent existence apart from the academy, end quote. The issue is hotly contested, but in many quarters, the rejection of religion as an analytical object approaches the consensus view. For those of you who are undergraduates, I should know we tend to reveal this to students at the end of the theory and method class that you have to take at some point before you graduate. There tends to be this moment of kind of horrific surprise. Maybe it's usually in the last couple of weeks, having gone through the Durkheims and the Webers, et cetera, we sort of jump out and say, and actually the concept of religion is a mess, and most scholars in religious studies try not to use it. Then we try not to make you feel too bad about that, and then the course is done and we move on. But this sort of malign surprise might seem to pose a special challenge for our discipline because religious studies has no distinctive method. We have no special approach. We teach no specific technical skills. We have no core principles, no single object language, no clearly delimited geography, people, or time period. The only thing we supposedly share is our commitment to a category we by and large no longer take seriously. It would seem, therefore, that we are lifting after many apocalypses. And it's true that category religion mainly survives in the work of scholars who are negatively preoccupied with demolishing it over and over and over and over again. While elsewhere, the discipline has lately been overwhelmed by a wave of radical particularity that is frightened of all generalizations. Both are errors. Merely uncritically repeating the words of our ethnographic interlocutors, retreating to the sociological survey, the fMRI, or the historical archive are not solutions, but rather temporary gestures. And as bad as the reign of so-called quote-unquote postmodern theory was, to renounce abstraction, as many now seem to be doing, is to abandon communication and to fall into fragmentation. Yet, we are not alone. Our dilemma is nothing less than the fate of the academy under the sign of the negative. Indeed, over the last few decades, scholars in a range of fields have increasingly rejected communication and meaningful abstraction, while the disciplines succumb to balkanization and increasing hyperspecialization. And it should be no surprise that as our common objects of analysis crumble, further forces pull us apart. But fortunately, the good news is that as older scholarly paradigms collapse, new possibilities emerge. From the rubble, I aim to recover a new method of advance. In their place, I'd like to put forward an approach that is neither deconstruction nor restoration. As a substitute, I think we need to find what Hegel would have called the negation of the negation. So how might one move forward? To deploy something now approaching a cliche, I think we need a Copernican revolution. There's some revolutions going around my head right here, maybe. We need to revolve the whole discipline on its axis. The center must shift if the field is going to hold. In some, what I argue is that all attempts to reaffirm the contours of the discipline by producing an alternate theory of a universal religion or replacing religion with near synonyms are doomed to failure. In broadest of brushstrokes, I want to foreclose the definitional efforts that gave birth to religious studies as a field. In other words, I aim to end the theory of religion. That's meant to sound ominous. I'm going to qualify stuff. Don't worry. Okay. In a gesture that may look like pulling the plug, I believe there is hope for the future. Although this talk is too short to do it justice, what follows is a prolegomena to an alternate discipline. Approached differently, I will argue that granting the critiques of religion and related analytical categories actually tell us something fundamental about the categories themselves. Based on a work elaborated in my new monograph, Metamodernism, I will argue that many of these critiques can be solved or addressed or deepened or inverted if the social world is understood in terms of a process social ontology. In this context, the very things that were supposed to have precluded the study of religion, the very things that were supposed to spell its demise, will turn out to be openings to what amount to a new theory of society and how it should be studied. So this work thus proffers a re-theorizing of the social sphere and its materialization, including a fresh theory of the formation of social categories applicable not just to religion, but also to race, science, art, and so on. Because I want to argue that if we want to change society, we need to understand it better. Let me tell you how I think we should begin. What was theory of religion? So one of the, in a recent monograph, Bruce Lincoln, one of the doyens of religious studies, noted that our discipline had fossilized an archaic canon of theorists. He listed Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, adding perhaps Freud or Geertz, and he observed that there are relatively few theoretical works in the discipline which, quote, have shown themselves to be of any lasting significance, and fewer still such works that have appeared in the last half century, end quote. Hence, Lincoln asks, quote, why is it that theoreticians working prior to 1925 or thereabouts were able to meet with such success and continue to exert such influence? And why is it that so little significant work has been done since their pioneering researchers, end quote. His answer is less important than his questions. I'm definitely not interested in returning to the so-called good old days of religious studies. But I think what Lincoln captures is that compared to a range of other disciplines, we have a strangely archaic fossilized canon of theorists. It's well illustrated in this book by Pauls, which captures the canon as often reflected in both teaching and research. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I took the theory of religion course at Amherst. Williams kids, I know rivals, don't hiss. But it was this exact canon minus Marx and plus Rudolf Otto, which you might read for anyway, the reasons that was the case. This is a very flat, very just demographically completely lacking in diversity, but maybe a couple Jews, but otherwise a very flat list. But even so, I'm returning to my notes here, even if you expand this canon, as we've often done at Williams, to include folks like W.E.B. Du Bois or Mary Douglas, the point largely stands. Insofar as we have a shared canon, it might represent a petrified collection of elders whose last significant contribution happened in the 1960s or maybe the 1970s. Not really, none of these are that late. So what are these theorists and what are we getting out of them? Well, Paul summarizes their argument as follows. His summaries aren't necessarily great, but sometimes he has quotes. And I think we're actually up to 10 theories of religion in Paul's because he finally realized there were no women on here and he added one in, but it's still not much better. Okay, so I'll just go through this list. So, religion is belief in, I actually won't read it. I'll just let you glance your eye over the religion is statements that he attributes to Tyler, Fraser, Freud, Durkheim, Marx, Weber, James, Eliade, Evans, Pritchard, and Geertz. Paul thinks that these are all attempts to answer the question, what is religion? What are its origins? And how should it be defined? And I've spent some time thinking about why folks like Weber pursued this theorizing, but they're trying to understand themselves or understand the role of quote unquote religion in modernity. There was a lot of questers, but there was also some cultural chauvinism, some proto-imperialism, etc. But we could also note, and I may be blocking with my body, that in terms of citations, most of these thinkers are no longer important to the field. Most of the citations, and I did a citational crawl through religious studies publications in the last 5 years, most of the citations to Tyler, Fraser and company, Eliade and Evans, Pritchard and Geertz are negative. There's some positive citations occasionally of Freud, Durkheim, a couple. The main ones we seem to be preserving are Marx and Weber and a little bit of William James, if you're keeping score. But the vast majority of the people, this isn't even our joint conversation anymore. Okay, this is just something that we unfortunately inflict on undergraduates. The religion department chair is here from Williams, and this is why I don't want to teach the theory method course again this year until we had a better conversation in the department about canon. But anyway, let's move forward. So this project has failed. It basically has. I don't want to say that there is no exceptions. There are some people trying to define things, but mostly they're either producing textbooks or they're doing cognitive science. And I'm going to tell you that the cognitive science route has some interesting insights, but is mostly a dead end. And some of this other work in textbooks, it's because there's a student interest, but it's ultimately, I think, based on misleading presuppositions. Yeah. There's some others, but these are a lot of them, and I'm happy to argue about any of them in greater detail later. But I will say the project is at least, if not completely failed, been challenged by a movement called critical religion, which we might attribute to Wilfred Cantwell Smith's 1962 work, The Meaning and End of Religion. But there are other host of folks who have, in a certain respect, become even more celebrated or known. J.Z. Smith, Talal Assad, Russell McCutcheon, Tomoko Masazawa, Brett Nongbury, and many more. Their basic argument is that religion is a hegemonic Euro-American and specifically Protestant concept imposed globally, often in the context of colonialism. For example, the assertion that the British invented Hinduism, and some claimed that there is no data for religion and that the concept itself is analytically useless. I built on the first part of this in my invention of religion in Japan, but tried to recover non-European voices to show how Japanese elites responded asymmetrically to European and American diplomacy to take tactical agency and invent religion in Japan. But it was a contribution to the argument in critical religion. One way to frame the argument, and this is a sort of a dense slide for those of you who've not come across it, is that the claim is that religion is functionally an early modern term. You can see this, for example, in the fact that many languages have imported their term for religion quite late. So this is why German religion, Dutch religie, French religion, Italian religione, Spanish religion, Portuguese religia, Romanian religie, Polish religia, all look like the same word. It's because there's no similar pre-modern usage, and religio, the Latin root of these, meant scruple or monastic, refer to monastics, and then piety, not anything people have argued like the current category of religion. It has also been argued that religion cannot be defined according to necessary and sufficient conditions. It appears in an unstable binary with the secular. It's colonial, normatively loaded word that always conveys a relationship to Christianity, and it tends to relativize whatever gets referred to as a religion, treating it as something optional or separate from the world as it exists. It's also been claimed that there's no non-European terms for religion. I'm dancing back and forth so that I can read my own slide. Already in 1921, it was argued that Greek has no word for religion. Then in 1937, it was argued that Iranian had no word for religion. And similarly, people have argued that neither Hebrew, nor ancient Greek, nor Nahuatl, nor Navajo, nor Xhosa, nor Chinese, nor Sanskrit, nor Indonesian, nor Japanese have indigenous words for religion. One might note, I always like to mention to students, the implication of its absence in Greek and Hebrew. Religion is not in the Bible, as has been argued. So to recap, religious studies fossilized a canon of theorists, that might be the wrong canon, anyway, typo, who attempted to define religion because they presumed it was a universal aspect of human nature. Many scholars have recognized fundamental flaws of this enterprise, although not all the arguments are equally good, and many began abandoning the category. Ironically, however, we have now begun canonizing a set of anti-theorists whose main contribution is to argue that religion is uniquely problematic. One popular quote from Brent Nongbre is, when one encounters the word religion in a translation of an ancient text, first cross out the word wherever it occurs. Use a different translation. It doesn't matter what, anything besides religion. So we're the anything besides religion department in certain respects. Okay, next section. Here's the thing. Religion isn't the only category that has problems. More than religion are effed up, or at least have encountered similar challenges. Let me explain. Wilfred Cantwell Smith came late to the party. A host of scholars in a range of disciplines have come to call into question the central categories of their disciplines. We might think in 1956, Moritz Weitz, the philosopher of aesthetics, challenged the notion of art. In 1958, Dorothy Emmett, society. Same year, Raymond Williams, culture. Norman Russell Hanson challenged science. Then Walter Ullman, the political. H.L.A. Hart, the law. Then we get Cantwell Smith in the same year that we get Thomas Kuhn, and then Hayden White challenging history to round out the decade in 1966, and the critiques have even amplified, if anything. I originally thought about writing the metamodernism book, and I had started writing chapters on each of those critiques, but after I did a lot of reading in detail, what I discovered was that the critiques are actually very, very similar. They follow similar strategies. And here, I want to teach you what those strategies are. Here's your chance to be an epistemological anarchist. You can blow up any category you want. Let's just pretend it's the category art. First step, you might begin with the immanent critique. Assemble competing definitions. There are a plurality of definitions of art. Argue on the basis of those definitions that it is not definable by necessary and sufficient conditions. Decompose the concept by saying that it is, saying about it what Wittgenstein said about games, that it is a family resemblance category. That might seem to be where it would stop, but this only causes more problems. Polythetic classes decay. You could then argue that the category is built not just on inclusions and resemblance, but on exclusions that it can't maintain. Art is often defined by reference to craft, which is the thing that's supposed to be not art, except that many of the things that are art are actually also crafts. Or you might introduce nominalist skepticism. You note that art is only an abstraction produced by art historians, and that people on the ground have been making things that only retroactively has been classified as art. Then, after you've done your immanent critique, if you want to knock things around a little bit more, you can do a relativizing critique. Begin your first order historicism. You can show how meaning changes. The fine arts emerged in Western Europe as an eclectic category, including sculpture, dance, and painting at a moment in time when those were becoming prestige categories among a certain stratum of elite patrons, and produced a notion of fine art. You could also do a second order historicism. You can show the genealogy. You can show not only how that there are multiple ruptures, but how power was at play in the production of the very thing that we might want to call fine art, the rise of the museum, the construction of places, the movement of works out of indigenous cultures and put into new settings where they're understood according to formal criteria. You could also do a culturally relativizing move. You could argue that they don't have our concept of the category, or you could note that the introduction of the category into a culture that lacks it produces changes. Introducing fine art into Japan caused a radical reconfiguration, not only of techniques and tools, how paintings were seen. It produced a notion of aesthetic experience that was previously absent. It reassembled indigenous materials in a new way, et cetera, et cetera. To these, you could add, although some people don't, ethical critiques. You could note that the definition of the category is normative. To call something art is often a work of praise. If I point at a painting and say, that's not art, I'm criticizing it. We could also note that the category is connected to either domination, colonialism, imperialism, sexism, racism, or violence. It's going to be hard to find a category that is not such connected, but you can play out those. Often then, all these arguments are then taken and to make the argument that the concept in question is socially constructed. Although sometimes socially constructed is taken as a synonymous with unreal, which is not something I'm down with for reasons I will explain later. I don't think these strategies are bad. I actually think these strategies are good, but they pose a certain problem. On the grounds that Nongbre and others have used to argue that religion is untranslatable, it would seem that all of these terms, culture, politics, society, art, are untranslatable. On the grounds that Assad and company have attacked religion as problematic and argued that it should be unusable or unavailable to scholars, all of these categories should be equally unavailable. We seem to be caught in an impasse. We seem to be, as the scripture, Buddhist scriptures once say, the Buddha entangling briars escape his golden lips. How much better would we be if he had not spoken? Perhaps this means we should not speak anything. Or maybe this means we should resist the critique. No, actually the opposite. I want to argue that we can deepen the critique and find something else out the other side. I want to argue for a process social ontology. Let me explain. I want to suggest that we can actually embrace what is good about many of these critiques if we shift from a substance to a process ontology of the social world. We can grant the critiques, but not all their supposed implications. A long history of thinking of the social world as something like natural kinds, as substances instead of processes. But there's a lot of evidence that this doesn't work. To explain, for those of you not up on your philosophy of science, what I mean by natural kinds are supposed to be the joints of nature. Although the term basically was revived in the 19th century and came to dominance a little bit later, it dates back to, the notion of natural kinds dates back to, in the Western historical context, Plato's Phaedrus, which describes the joints of nature, but you can actually find, for those of you who are keeping score, a similar metaphor in Chuang-Tzu as well. As Muhammad Ali Khalidi has argued, natural kinds share a bundle of properties in view of their essences, and therefore their properties are supposed to be projectable. He lists a bunch of features, but some of these include that they're commonly believed to be definable according to necessary and sufficient conditions. They're supposed to have modal necessity. They're supposed to be mind independent. And the main classical idea, it's hard to know what counts as a natural kind but the one that people tend to focus on is atomic elements like gold, which, it has properties in view of its constitution, seems to exist in any possible world in which there are atomic elements, and as far as we can tell is mind independent. But religion and none of these other categories, they don't have a common essence. It can't be defined, I would argue. It lacks modal necessity, and it's definitely mind dependent. So it's not a natural kind in that way. Instead, what I want to suggest that we should think about is in terms of processes, not natural kinds. There's a reason that I'm contrasting those, but I'll have to spell it out later. Evidence from language change, cultural change, economics change, societal change, etc., whatever we call the social world, and that's a term that's a little bit of a mess, but I'll just put it in quotes now, is a world in motion. Everything that we think of, that we surround ourselves, I don't think it should be a shock to say that it is constantly shifting and changing, but we often don't analyze it or think about it that way. We're actually beginning to see little prickles of a sign toward a process orientation. I see this in a shift in language that I actually rather like, a shift toward minoritization instead of minority, to racialization instead of race. I'm going to argue that we should perhaps, I don't know if we actually need the word, but we could talk about religionization instead of religion. I'm not really trying to get rid of our nouns, but you can see the thrust of what I'm pushing us toward. If you can see that this linguistic shift is already trying to do that, which is an emphasis on unfolding processes, things done to people rather than essentializing them as fixed or static. I want to suggest also that instead of positing homogeneity or stability, or jointed kinds, we need to start from diversity, heterogeneity, difference, and change. That comes from thinking of the world in a non-metaphorical sense, really social world as processes. We should assume that the social world is flux, unstable, chaotic, complex, diverse, overflowing with meaning. We should presume change and difference. this flips Foucauldian genealogy on its head, because instead of unmasking false unities, instead of showing how there are discontinuities or differences, the thing to be explained is even temporary zones of stability or homogeneity. I call those temporary zones of stability social kinds, process social kinds. I'm going to say this is a gesture, a description, not a definition. They're socially constructed, dynamic, homeostatic, and heterostatic clusters of properties and capacities, which are demarcated by the causal processes that anchor the relevant clusters. That's so dense. I'll happy to unpack it in the Q&A, but I mean social here just as shorthand for socially constructed kinds, not as social in contrast to cultural or political or something like that. There are three features to keep in mind about social kinds. Basically, like, you know, the social world is incredibly chaotic. The fact that it isn't baffling, the fact that I can go out my door and be fairly confident that when I go to the cheese shop and order cheese, I get something that is reasonably stinky and made out of cows or sheep milk or whatever, is because there's certain kinds of limited stability. But there are three features you need to keep in mind about these social kinds. They themselves are the products of unfolding processes. They tend to be entropic or extremely varied, both temporally and spatially. Social kinds cross-cut each other so that the same entity can be the intersection of different kinds. Social kinds exceed their reference. The same word can refer to different kinds, and different words can refer to the same kind. That's quite different than what I think a lot of scholars think that they're doing, even on the critical side of religion. This lets us invert the critique. This lets us take all the things that were part of that critical edifice and actually grant them as features of social kinds. All the deconstructive martial arts, we can now show that that's actually just the features of the way that we composite our social world, and not just humans, but other social animals. So social ends turn out to be deessentialized. They tend to be historically or culturally contingent. They tend to be undefinable. They tend to be, to borrow a word from Buddhist philosophical vocabulary, nishvabhava. In other words, they're interdependent. They cross-cut. They tend to be, as they're referred to, they tend to be abstractions or reifications. They exhibit mind dependency. They tend to be normative, and social kinds are in some significant respect process kinds. Then the thing that becomes really important if one wants to study social kinds is thinking about what is it that actually anchors the processes. In other words, what is it that causes there to be any stability at all? And in the book, I lay out a bunch of anchoring processes. I won't go into any detail about them right now, but basically what gets a member into a social kind is the capacities or properties, what the entity can do, and the causal processes that cause the entity to have those properties or capacities in the first place. These are these anchoring processes. So last time I presented some of this stuff, I got a bunch of questions about translation. This is a sort of an addendum, single slide. I did because some folks in critical religion, and I see myself coming out of that movement, but think that the problem is just a problem of translation. And some other folks actually think that translation as such is impossible. This bothers me. Many of the arguments for that translation is impossible. Let's list some of them: Jacques Derrida and Walter Benjamin and Barbara Kaysen and Jose Ortega y Gasset and Quine and Thomas Kuhn, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all different arguments that translation is impossible, basically. But here's the problem with it. One, many of the most famous critiques of translation are themselves primarily read in translation. So if you think translation is impossible and you're getting it from Derrida and you've read Derrida in English, there's something suspicious going on. Second, and even more fundamentally, there's a paradox that every argument for the impossibility of translation proves translation is impossible by providing evidence for its claim. So in arguing for why he war is untranslatable, Derrida provides an extensive translation of he war. That's not just true of Derrida, but true of all of these. Benjamin Gasset, Quine is the only exception, and it's partially because he's hiding what Gavagai actually means. This means the payoff here is that speakers of the same language don't share concepts. You probably know different things about birch trees than I do, especially if you know more about them than I can point at them, but I don't know anything else about them. And we probably disagree about the extensions of things like color terms. We disagree about the edge cases, about what counts as blue or what have you. Translation is possible, but it isn't one-to-one word. And every translation is an interpretation. So, or an inference, we might say. So sometimes translation necessitates changing the target language. To translate iPhone into Kosa requires producing a new word. The same was true of religion. So I've been, for a little while now. I'm just going to touch on comparison after religion, but I won't dwell on it. So what I want to suggest is that we can go back to something like why do we scholars and non-scholars alike use the word religion? In other words, despite this concerted scholarly effort to delete religion from people's vocabularies, I want to suggest that the term religion, like other similar terms, is primarily about coordinating reference, communicating particular inferences, and making certain kinds of generalizations. Generalizations as such, I want to argue, are not necessarily problematic. As Kawasi Wiridu argues, decolonizing philosophy necessitates unmasking spurious universals, but not all generalizations are equally or necessarily false. The issue is not that we generalize, but how. Of course, the broader the generalization one aims to make, like if you're talking about zeitgeists, the higher the standard of evidence needs to be. That's part of why I don't take zeitgeists seriously. But part of what we want to do as scholars, policymakers, and just ordinary people and so on, is to make comparisons. That's a kind of generalization we might want to make. And I'm going to argue that comparison is cognitively basic. Choosing what to put in a fruit salad is a comparative act. Comparison is also nearly unavoidable, a byproduct of translation. To translate or reject the translation of Imani's faith implies comparison, so we're stuck with comparison. Comparison is often described in terms of discovering a similarity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how similarity, everything, as Watanabe Satoshi has argued, everything is similar to everything else. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'll say judgments of degrees of similarity tend to be task dependent. So it's like when you're sorting bags at the airport. This is my favorite example. It isn't arbitrary, but it's task dependent. So if the baggage handler is sorting bags, he or she is going to pick up the bags that weigh similarly are going to be more similar, or maybe the bags that are shaped similarly are going to be more similar. For the fashionista, the bags that are from the same brand are going to be more or less similar. The Louis Vuittons will all seem the same. But for me, as somebody in the airport, the bags that are most similar are the ones that I own, and that could be bags from totally different brands and totally different kinds of things. So in that respect, similarity itself is task dependent, and judgments of difference are actually part of the same logic. They're equally fraught. Some people think you can just go to difference and not do similarity and that's going to solve problems, but really it's the same logic, and there's no reason to fetishize difference. Well, that was a bit of a tour, and I kind of went through that a little bit quickly, but what I just want to suggest is that I'll just skip ahead a couple slides, that we can actually do comparison, but neither similarity nor difference is sufficient. We need a causal account of why a particular case comes to have the relevant cluster of properties. Hence, we needed to study what I was calling anchoring processes earlier. I'm happy to explain any of that because I had to rush it, but I want to continue to the next bit. I thought I might not have time for that one, but I couldn't resist squeezing it in. And I've argued that things like religions share the properties they do today, not because of being inherently members of the same universal natural kind, but in good part because of classificatory processes, enforcement mechanisms that are such as those by the nation state, international treaty, etc., that have produced those similarities. I'll explore this in greater detail in a moment. Okay. Time for the conclusion. And as some of you were noting from spotted me on Twitter, I've just written this. So with the help of my buddy Jeff, who's in the audience, who was a sounding board for some of this. So here we go. First, I want to give you a couple examples so that you have a sense of what I mean by social kinds. So let's take the iPhone as an example of a social kind. A given object might be a member of multiple overlapping social kinds. It is a phone, an iPhone, a camera, etc. An iPhone has specific properties that changes over iterations. So generation, whatever this is, old and clunky iPhone has a particular set of properties. New properties happen in new iterations, including physical and social properties. It is anchored through mimesis and classification, manufacturing that rejects bad copies, and classificatory processes like patents that regulate how it is defined and what it is. That may be too concrete. Let me give you something that's more religious studies appropriate. How Buddhism became a religion in Japan. The old question from religious studies would have been, is Buddhism a religion? And those of you who teach Buddhism has probably got this. When I teach Zen Buddhism, I almost always get this question on the first day. Is Zen a religion? This turns out to be a misformulated question. Instead, we need to study, I want to argue, the religionizing processes through which Buddhism came to share more properties in common with other social kinds similarly classified as religions. What were those? What did happen? How did that happen? So first, we note that there was no indigenous Japanese term for religion, depending on how you define it. Buddhism was produced according to its own logics, its own classificatory processes in the preceding period, which we could talk about in some detail, what Buddhism was like before religion. But let's say that religion arrived in 1853, and then a lot of things happened in this period from 1853 to 1889. it was contingent whether Buddhism was going to be classified as religion, politics, superstition, or science, if Buddhism was one religion or several religions. Buddhism was forcibly separated from Shinto, although incompletely. There was a tax system that worked to demarcate Buddhism from commerce and politics, an education reform act that worked to demarcate Buddhism from education and philosophy, an anti-superstition campaign that worked to demarcate Buddhism from superstition and science, and so on. This led to the Pan-Asianism and the globalization of Buddhist studies. I trace this in more detail, but than I probably have time for. But it led ultimately to the foundation of Buddhist sectarian universities in the 1920s and the production of the Taisho Tripitaka, which was the collection of Buddhist scriptures that has radically transformed almost the whole East Asian Buddhist world. It also led to Japanese colonialism in Korea and some messy stuff there as well. As a case study, we might say, I want to argue, before we couldn't talk about Buddhism in relationship to religion. In fact, the main conversation in Buddhist studies was to shut that down. But instead, we can now talk about how Buddhism becomes a religion by being linked up to the world system of law, discourse, scholarship, institutions, etc. We can talk about the anchoring processes, the properties that changed, even as we must be careful not to back project properties. We see partial fusions, we see partial demarcations, we see massive institutional material changes, and then we see that the globalization of Buddhism and its transformation into religion then transforms both the scholarly category of religion and the legal category of religion elsewhere. So it reflects back on the whole global system because things are interdependent. Let me try this again. What are the implications of this for religious studies? And now we're in the concluding lap, so bear with me here. The old project of theory of religion is dead. The whole enterprise should be over. There is no definition of religion. The project of conceptual analysis initiated by Plato and company has failed, not just in religion, but across the disciplines. As Paul Elburn remarked, despite 2,400 years or so of trying, it is unclear that anyone has ever come up with an adequate definition of any words whatsoever. Religious studies has no distinctive method, no sui generis domain, no geographic terrain, no distinct people. We mostly don't believe in the category anymore. These are often taken to be obstacles. The language of impasse is widespread for good reason, and not just within the humanistic disciplines. We could continue to ratchet up the autocritique. We could continue the self-martyrdom of weak but self-important intelligentsia. We could continue lamenting the absence of Archimedean possibilities outside the unfolding horizon of history. We could continue to endlessly repeat the act of deconstruction, to universalizing anti-universalism. We could embrace a hermeneutics of suspicion that is suspicious of everything but itself. We could continue to cut off every conceivable route toward generalization, all while petrochemical companies pollute the globe and poison our earth and air. That's one option. It's not the one I want to pursue. But actually, I want to argue that what we thought were the reasons to stop studying religion, what we thought were the reasons to flagellate ourselves, could be our impetus for a new and creative religious studies. The other side of deconstruction is not an abyss, but freedom. We must start from the problematic and not terminate it. I'm not trying to wash away the deconstructive gesture. I want to start from it. I want to start recognizing the problematic course of history, all the ethical, intellectual problems, but start from them, not end in them. There is still scholarship to be done in the study of religion. It just can't presume the universality of the category, and nor can it default into brute anti-essentialism. We need more sophisticated anti-essentialism. But that makes religion, quote unquote, more, not less amenable to study. I've been arguing the process social kinds theory can provide a new approach, an inversion of Foucauldian genealogy. It presumes heterogeneity and difference. The thing that we were explaining, the exact opposite thing. We thought we had to explain change, but instead we have to explain stability and homogeneity as exceptions. The enterprise of unmasking, we can unmask. Relativism, we can relativize. We can refocus our attention on the anchoring processes that resist change or that aim to produce homogeneity. In other words, we trace boundary policing in the systems of power that have produced and are stabilizing the social kinds. To be clear, anchoring processes are neither bad nor inherently good. Just, for example, institutions are not inherently enemies, but they need to be renewed, abolished, eliminated once they lose their purpose or become systems of oppression or systems of something that I can't say because I'm standing in front of it. The shared anchoring processes is how we do better comparison. It's how we change things. So we need to reflect on the ethical implications of our work. We need to make the project's time and space qualifications, to not mistake up and downstream processes. We do this all the time. We don't always do it enough in religious studies. We would say the population of Williamstown, MA, we give a number that has to be time demarcated. We need not make the mistake of attributing properties to religions in different contexts and periods without shared anchoring processes. That we lack a method is a virtue, not a failing, because many methods are relevant. The academic disciplines were organized around categories which were supposed to be analytically distinct, economics and culture, and supposed to require different methodologies. But process social kinds theory suggests that this is wrong. Categories cross-cut. The relationship between disciplines needs to be reconceptualized. In a shifting world, that we lack a territory is not a curse, but a blessing. We still often talk past each other. There are more than one social kind covered by the term religion. Communication is fallible. Translation is difficult, but it is possible. And it is often transformative. Socially constructed does not mean non-existent. Socially constructed does not mean unreal. But once we recognize that we make our own worlds, it means that we can work to study them in new ways, to understand them better, to improve or demolish them, to transform them, to struggle together to build a better world that we are constantly in the process of self-fashioning. Our world can be better. We are faced with unfolding global catastrophes, such as the pandemic, anthropogenic climate change, economic crisis, racialized injustice, and political polarization. And many people have lost their capacity to even imagine better futures. Perhaps this is why we as a society have no problem picturing the end of the world. Fictional dystopias and apocalypses are abundant, while utopias are scarce. This is a problem, because as numerous political theorists have observed, it is hard to organize meaningful change around cynicism and nihilism. But in our dystopian present, it makes it even more important to imagine and even work together to realize better futures. In dark times, it becomes even more important to fan the flames of emancipation. We often feel bound and trapped by the categories that are imposed upon us. But I have been aiming to share some good news and a new vision, maybe a vision of radical hope. It isn't going to be easy, but the world is change. And if we understand it better together, we can change it for the better. Thank you. If you have any questions, hopefully there's plenty of time for Q&A. You can also email me there. I'm very slow about email. I'm sorry, I'm terrible lately. I blame being a parent, but maybe it's also the pandemic. You can also find me on Twitter. You can also find me other places as well. This has been a real treat. Thank you for entertaining me, letting yourself be entertained by me. And I look forward to comments and questions about this or about the Metamodernism book as such. Thank you. Thank you.